Yes, okay. So we will begin this evening with the Vajradhara lineage prayer. So then we will do the prayers for the mandala and so forth. So as usual, when we recite the Vajradhara lineage prayer, we should recite this with faith and devotion. But if we're going to recite it with faith and devotion, we have to think about the reasons why we would have faith and devotion when we recite it. This is a prayer that we, in our Karma Kagyu lineage, it's like gives the essence of the main instructions of our principal practice, the practice of Mahamudra. And these are instructions given by Pengar Champo Sampo, who was the teacher, the student of the 6th Karmapa and the teacher of the 7th. So he's one of the main lineage holders of the Karma Kagyu lineage. So he was late 14th century, early 15th century. So it's around the turn of the 15th century. And he spent a lot of time with, he wasn't actually originally, when he was with the 6th Karmapa, he wasn't really any high lama or anything at first, but he got the instructions, he meditated upon them. And then after he realized the meaning, and then after the 6th Karmapa, I'm not sure if it was after the 6th Karmapa passed away or not. At any rate, at some point, Pengar Champo Sampo went off to go meditate on an island in the middle of a lake in northern Tibet. This is a large lake, and there's an island in the middle, and they didn't have such good boats. In Tibet at that time, they had little coracles that they would make with, leather hulls and a wood frame. But it wasn't a reliable way to get to this island in the middle of the lake. So the only way you could go to the island in the middle of the lake was to wait until the lake froze over in the winter. So he went there and he spent 18 years meditating on Mahamudra while he was there. Other lamas, in particular Lorepa, who was a great master of the Trukpa Kagyu school, there's a great stories about him and all the difficulties. And they're great stories for us right now. It probably wasn't great stories then. He was on this island. He got stuck. The ice didn't freeze for 3 years. The lake just didn't freeze over, and so he ran out of supplies and had great difficulties. His attendant was beside himself. They had like nothing left. They were making tormas that were the size of peas and having just thin gruel. And the attendant was like, "What can I do to keep my master?" And he's like, so he said to his master, to Lorepa, there's a corpse of the deer has washed up by the ocean, by the lake right now, by the seashore. So why don't you go down and get him? He was planning to go kill himself. And so, and actually the corpse of the deer would have been his own. He wanted to kill himself so that his lama would have something to eat. And Lorepa really realized what was happening. And then they prayed, and then the Dharmic protectors and local deities made a bridge of ice across and they were able to go back. And so they had to go back, and they were able to go get some food. But when Pengar Sampo spent his time on the ocean, he didn't have any, or in this island on the lake, he didn't have any such difficulties. He spent a long time there, and when he was finished, he sang this song, which has become one of the great prayers that we do. So here's someone who sought out the solitude of body and mind, did the meditation. And because of this, he realized the ultimate meaning to such a point that he was able to then be the teacher of the 7th Karmapa, the 7th Karmapa's main teacher. So this is also an example for us that if we do this, if we devote ourselves to it, we can also achieve realization by following these instructions. The translation here is a new translation that is kind of a collaboration between our Kagyu Munlam translation team, which is basically me and another translator friend, Lama Eric Tubelhorn, and the Marpa Translation Society, which is the translation group at the Sekar retreat center where Khenpo Rinpoche teaches. And so we worked on this, and the idea was to make it possible to sing this this prayer in English, just as we can do, and to be able to do it easily and smoothly. And so that we won't do it in English tonight. We might do it tomorrow. So when you recite it, that's why you have a slightly different, somewhat different translation than you are familiar with at this point. And every translation, of course, has its benefits, so it's good to compare and think about the meaning. At any rate, as we recite this, it's good to good to know what we're reciting and why. So please think about this with faith and devotion as we recite the, oh, I gotta play it. That helps. All right, now you've got it. So think about it with faith and the meaning with faith and devotion as you recite the words. Du som shedra gunjen karma ba che je chun je ju bar zinandam de ta ca sum balen dro ba so sablam cha ja che lang Nyame rogunda voga jula so de so ka jula manam juba zeno nam thar jin jivo sheno gom ji gam bar so bashin senor kuna chajen me padam sende de ta jube gom shena Yegur Shemba Mevar Jinjilo Muru Gomjigor Soimbashin Mengatergo Jibilar Mala Jundu Solwade Begom Shena Jeme Mogu Jewar Jinjilo Eme Gom Jingwajir Soimbashin Kanshar Tobengo Somade Majde Karajobe Gom Chenam Gom Chalotan Rajinjilo Nam Dongo Chugur Sumbashin Jiamayin Jiryang Charwala Mangaro Bar Charwe Gom Chema Kurde Medobra Jinjilum Kewa Gundu Yang Dalamatam Dalme Chudi Palalon Jijing Next, we will recite the prayers for the 7-branch prayer, and then the mandala offering, and then the request to teach. And I might as well talk a little bit about those before we do it. Generally, traditionally, it's taught, and so these are in the book. I don't think, did I put them in what I sent to you, Ted? No, we don't have them. Okay, I got to remember. Oh, yeah. Okay. So they're in the red binders for those of you in person. For those of you who are online, I have done a little bit to prepare. Probably not as much as I should, but a little bit. And so they'll be showing up online in the screen share. When you make a request for the teaching, before a teacher teaches the Dharma, it's traditional to make the request. And this is partially, it's kind of like when the Buddha first taught the Dharma. First, after he'd attained enlightenment, he stayed under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya and didn't teach the Dharma. He thought to himself, this is just too profound, what I've understood, he said. Deep peace, unelaborate, luminous, non-compound, like nectar it is, this Dharma I've found. Whomever I would teach it would not understand it, and so I shall stay in this wood without speaking. And then then Brahma and Indra realized that they needed to ask him, they needed to request that the Buddha teach the Dharma. And so the Buddha then, he made the request, they offered him a right turning conch and a wheel. And then he went to Varanasi and turned the first wheel of Dharma. So we always start teachings by making a request to teach, in part to remind us of what the deity of the Buddha. When you want to receive a Dharma teaching, you have to ask for it. We're not going to knock on your door and say, hello, would you like the little blue book of Buddhism? We're going, you have to ask. It has to be something that you want. And so there's this, of course, being traditionally, there's a way of asking that if you're going to receive a Dharma teaching, you have to have a lot of merit. So the ways to gather a lot of merit are first to go through the 7-branch offering of prostrating, confessing, rejoicing. Oh, what are the Chasavad and Chijing Shabbat and Chasavad and Chasavad. So prostrating, offering, confessing, rejoicing, requesting the Buddha to turn the wheel of Dharma, requesting the Buddha not to pass into nirvana, and then dedicating the merit. So you have to do those 7. And there are longer prayers to do it, but we do the short 7-branch prayer. And if you think to yourself, and especially if you do it in English, but as you do it, we'll do it in Tibetan tonight. As you do it, if you think to yourself, oh, I'm, making offerings, confessing, and so forth, and think that if you're doing that as you do it, then it actually can really feel like you're doing the 7-branch offering. So it's not just like saying, okay, I got to get through this prayer. Of course, when we're doing it in Tibetan, it's hard. That's a given. And then another way to make a great offering, or a large accumulation of merit, is to make a mandala offering. And so as you recite the mandala offering, you think that, oh, I'm giving everything, the entire universe, every universe, all the universes that we don't know about, I'm offering them all to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and representing the representative and the teacher, giving them to them, and then in order to gather the accumulation of merit. Because if you are going to be able to receive a Dharma teaching, you have to have merit. So that's why we've got to make the offering of merit. And then finally, there's the request to teach. And this is a 4-line request to teach. And this is one that I believe was written by Atisha. It comes from the 7-branch prayer to the Green Tara that Atisha wrote. And so I'm assuming it might have been a traditional one in India that Atisha then kind of put together and that we use. But so that's the one that we normally say, requesting the teacher to turn the wheel, the greater common and the greater lesser and common, or the great foundation and common vehicles, and requesting that to teach the Dharma. Because then once you've asked, then it's easier to teach. So that's just an explanation of why we go through these at the beginning. And so that is what we will go through now. Have you all found it in the book if you would like to join along? And so here it is. Chance. Share. O chatsel wadan chujing shapatam jesu yirang kusheng sulwai gerwa jungze dagi jisaka tamje dagi changchu chirho Saji puju jukshin meto tram rira dingji nide jempade sangye shingdo midde pulwayi roku namda shinba chubar sho semje namgi sampatam loye chera jitawar chechun tumun tepayi chege kolo kordo Ome chichi kora neru zunzane kunjingo ni ranzun jungo zunzun zunga pada name dambe shabla guja. The Dharma expanse palace of Akanishta is the essence of the Buddhas of all three times who shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted gurus. Please bless me and all sentient beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arises wisdom. And now think to yourself that we are listening to these Dharma teachings this evening in order to benefit ourselves and all other sentient beings. And the fact that we've come here and are teaching and listening to the Dharma, I think shows that in general, we have this motivation of wanting to do something beneficial. The fact that we've logged in or come or whatever we're doing, it shows that there is some intention to do something beneficial, but anytime you do, I mean, it's easy for your motivation to change. And so as Rinpoche often says, it's important for us to remind ourselves of our motivation when you begin something, because whether what you're doing is going to end up being fruitful or not depends upon your motivation. And when the motivation is, so if your motivation is negative, if you had a hard time finding parking or something bad happened on the way, or you had difficulty logging on or something went wrong when you were come here, when you're on your way here, coming to the teaching, or if you just got distracted, it's possible that your motivation might have changed. So it's always good to remind yourself to have a good motivation. When you have good motivations, there are different levels of motivation that we can have. And if you have any of these different levels of motivation, it's good, because they're good motivations. The motivation to help yourself and others now in this world. Motivation to kind of think about it on a larger level to help yourselves and others into the future lifetimes, however they may be. Or the motivation to achieve liberation, whatever that means. The motivation to bring yourselves and all sentient beings to achieve liberation, the motivation of bodhicitta. Whichever level of motivation you actually have, try to have any of these sort of 4 different levels of motivations, they're all good motivations. And in particular, if you find yourself if you look at yourself and you see in your heart that actually, oh yeah, you could mouth the words and saying, I have the motivation of bodhicitta. Yes, I want to achieve Buddha. But actually inside yourself, you say, I just want to feel good now. That's okay, because we're ordinary sentient beings. It takes a long time to train ourselves. But you can try to improve. You say, okay, my actual motivation right now is, I just want to feel better. But it would be really nice if I actually had the motivation of bodhicitta. So maybe I'm going to pretend to have bodhicitta, fake it till I make it. You know, if you do that, then you can kind of work to improve your motivations. And so this is a good way to work with your motivations. And so so in this way, please listen with as good a motivation as you can, preferably the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to bring all sentient beings to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. The Dharma that we are listening to is the way of the Bodhisattva by the great being Shantideva, and the multi-year course. And so this year we are on the 8th chapter, the chapter on meditation. The chapter on meditation has two main parts: the chapter on achieving solitude of body and mind, which we spoke about last weekend. And so this weekend we have the section on the meditation of on bodhicitta. And so in particular, this is when we speak about the motivations, we're talking about meditating on bodhicitta. So it's helpful to have bodhicitta motivation, or it's helpful to want to develop the bodhicitta motivation, because it's difficult to actually really have, I mean, because even when you're just talking about relative bodhicitta, the wish to bring each and every single sentient being in any universe to the state of completely perfect enlightenment, this is difficult to conceive, probably impossible for ordinary beings such as ourselves to really conceive. And so we have to meditate upon it. And so that's what we're at the point that we've come to in this chapter. But before we get here, there is one thing that I want, before we begin with that, there's one thing I want to add to the sections about, like that we spoke about last weekend, which is getting solitude of body and solitude of mind. When we talk about going for solitude of body and solitude of mind, solitude of body is withdrawing yourself from society and going on retreat. And the solitude of mind is really meditating on the nature of desires as being inherently unsatisfactory, as being inherently dangerous in terms of they are what will hook us back into samsara and prevent us from achieving liberation, and then cause us to fall into the lower realms again in future lives. Basically, they're the cause of all our problems in this life and future lifetimes. For that reason, it's important to deal with the desires. And so you have to gain this, you need to think about, in this instance, primarily thinking about the defects of what you would have desire for. So that's the basic idea of the solitude of body and the solitude of mind. But there's one additional point that kind of occurred to me as talking with various people over the last week, is that you also have to make sure that even if you're not going to go off and retreat, when you're doing a certain type of practice, you have to make sure that the texts that you're reading, the things that you're putting in, the inputs that you're bringing in, are inputs that are going to help you in your practice. Now, of course, here in the Dharma group, the way we generally do it here is that, in a session, we'll do a bit of meditation and then have some discussion, usually on a book. And so there's that book that goes along. But also, if you're doing a particular type of, if you're doing a particular type of meditation, there are different types of texts that work better for it. And you don't want to necessarily be reading every single Dharma text out there because it may not be appropriate. For example, I'm working on translations of epistemology. And if I were to go on retreat and keep working on epistemology while I'm doing retreat, it wouldn't work. But even if you get all sorts of different books, like and particularly there are a lot of people doing doing the Ngundro practice. And so in Ngundro practice, it's really helpful to read texts such as the Way of the Bodhisattva, because it really helps you develop that bodhicitta motivation, reminds you of the four thoughts that turn the mind, and so forth. So that's a very good one to read. And also the lives of the different masters. Of course, we focus in the Kamra Kagyu lineage on Marpa Milarepa and Gampopa and the Kagyu masters, the Karmapas, and so forth. Those are, of course, important. But also reading about Patra Rinpoche, because there's the wonderful collection of stories or life of Patra Rinpoche and Enlightened Vagabond, which is really inspiring. And so reading texts like that is really helpful for Ngundro practice in particular. Okay. So now we have come to the passage on right. I'm getting the right one. I have to make sure that I'm sharing the right file today, the right screen. and move it someplace where I can see it on the screen. Okay, so we're going to talk about the meditation on relative bodhicitta, the equality of oneself and others. And so we'll start right in with a text, although I'll probably have a few digressions. So here, the first stanza, this begins on stanza 89 of the text, which reads, once you've reflected on these and others advantages of solitude, then fully pacify your thoughts and meditate on bodhicitta. So here, this is like a transition between the two sections. It's saying, once you've reflected on these and other advantages of solitude. So we just, last week when we closed with a section where he's talking about the joys of being in retreat in palace, in forests, and like you're wandering on large flat stones that are like delightful palaces. The joys of being in these isolated areas is like, it's contentment that you can't get even no matter how wealthy or how powerful you are in the world. So these are the advantages of solitude. Then fully pacify your thoughts and meditate on bodhicitta. So we have to meditate on bodhicitta. And when we talk about meditating on bodhicitta, as I mentioned last week, we do have the issue. Generally, when we talk about meditation, we have shamatha meditation, we have insight meditation, these two types of meditation. So as I mentioned last week, when we're meditating on bodhicitta, actually, we're kind of doing both of these meditations. So to speak about this a little bit more, shamatha meditation in its essence is being able to rest your mind without getting distracted. And so, especially in the earlier stages of shamatha meditation, you could say it's being able to rest your mind one-pointedly on a focus of meditation. And that's the way it's generally taught in the sutra tradition. So there are different ways of looking at it. So it's just being undistracted or of resting your mind one-pointedly. So and that can be anything. So it can be, as we start in our Kamakaja tradition, we start with, usually visualizing or focusing on a visual form or something like that, but being able to rest there, or commonly we often meditate on our breath and so forth, being able to rest on that. That's shamatha meditation. So the idea is to become serene, so that when things happen, which if they're not, your mind is not going to stop. You're able to maintain your focus or not get distracted from what you're doing. It's not to stop your mind. It's supposed to be able to rest your mind. And so this is the type of meditation that we commonly in Dharma centers in the United States and West, it's what we commonly start out by teaching, is the shamatha meditation. The other type of meditation is insight meditation. And insight meditation, you might automatically think, oh, that's doing Mahamudra meditation or Dzogchen or some meditating on the nature of the mind. But actually, there are many different levels of insight meditation. And it's a term that's even used by non-Buddhists. In the Hindu tradition, they also talk about vipassana. And so for them, vipassana is being able to free yourselves from the desires of the lower realms and achieve the stability of the higher realms, the form and the formless realms. And they consider this to be moksha, or liberation. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, we say that those are actually temporary states, long-lasting but temporary states. So we don't really think of that as being insight meditation. But anytime you're doing any meditation that is giving you a slightly deeper level of understanding of the nature of things, that actually is a type of insight meditation. So like the meditations on repulsiveness we spoke about last weekend, compared to a worldly understanding, are a better understanding of the nature of our bodies. Then the meditations on impermanence, suffering, selflessness, and emptiness, and from the perspective of looking at the Four Noble Truths and seeing the nature of the Four Noble Truths, this is also insight meditation, because you're seeing more deeply the nature of how things are. And then you can go into meditations, more conceptual meditations on emptiness and so forth, that are also can be considered insight meditations. And finally, you get to the meditations, or maybe after even a few more steps, I might have skipped over a few steps. If you go through all the stages of emptiness in texts such as Kamala Shilas, there are probably a few more steps, but to cut to the chase, you can get to the meditations on the nature of the mind, the meditation on the empty, luminous nature of all phenomena, the nature of our mind. And so when we meditate on that, that of course is the ultimate sort of insight. But really, when you're talking about, if you're talking about insight, when you're meditating upon the empty and luminous nature of all phenomena, you're actually meditating on the nature of Buddha. The nature of your mind is Buddha. The Buddha is that. So this is in itself, it is bodhicitta, because it is focusing on Buddhahood. The characteristic of bodhicitta, if you want to talk about all the different types of bodhicitta, is a focus on Buddha, thinking about Buddha, or thinking or imagining or observing or directly perceiving Buddha on any of these different levels. That's what we mean by bodhicitta. So when you are focusing on the ultimate nature, the unelaborate, ultimate, luminous nature of all phenomena, the nature of the mind, that is Buddha. And so for that meditation is bodhicitta. When you are focusing on bringing all sentient beings to Buddhahood, that also is focusing on Buddha. You want to take all sentient beings and bring them and free them of all suffering, which means that you're bringing them to Buddhahood. This is relative bodhicitta. So it's also focusing on Buddhahood, which is focusing on the ultimate, unelaborate, luminous nature of all phenomena. And in this sense, then the relative bodhicitta also becomes an insight meditation, because it's also meditating on the actual nature. You've got the appearances of how things are, the relative appearance of things that are interdependent. That interdependent appearance is not separate than the ultimate nature of how they actually are. You can't take the nature of something away from the thing. For example, on a kind of different level, like the nature of fire is that it's hot. You can't take the heat away from the fire. I often laugh about this when we have translations. Since I'm a translator, I have to talk about translation. We often read translations where you talk about things are free of any inherent nature. So if they're free of an inherent nature, does that mean that there's an exherent nature that they still have? And if that nature is exherent, then how can it be their nature? It's like senses. The nature has to be inherent. I'm sorry, I'm going off on this academic or philosophical, but the nature is part of it. So you're focusing on sentient beings. You've got that wish to bring all sentient beings to Buddhahood. That also is insight meditation. But in order to make it easier, because it's difficult for us to realize the ultimate nature of things to begin with, you have to start with relative bodhicitta. And that relative bodhicitta then starts with meditation on compassion and so forth. And so we begin this by meditating on the equality of self and other here in this. Actually, there are other steps that you can go through, developing compassion and so forth, before you begin to think about bodhicitta itself. But basically, this is where we begin. And so, as it says in the text, the verse reads, "First meditate ardently upon the equality of self and other. They're equal in both pain and pleasure, so protect everyone like yourself." So what this verse is saying is you have to meditate on bodhicitta. And what you're meditating is that we are equal. There's the equality of self and other. So self, what does self mean? It means me. Anytime you see self, you should think me, and not the me, not my me, your own me. Right? This is important. It's not like the equality of me and other doesn't mean, okay, oh, Khenpo David's talking about himself. You should be thinking about yourself, me. And then other is all other sentient beings, every other sentient being. So you and any other sentient being, no matter what realm they're in, we're all the same. We're equal in both pain and pleasure. So protect everyone like yourself. So here there are a couple of really interesting points that we kind of need to think about. The first thing is when we are talking about equality. And as I was thinking about it this evening, or in the past couple of days, it's a different understanding of equality than we normally use in English, particularly in American English, where we talk about equality as a political thing. Equality means equal rights, equal opportunities. Everyone's treated the same. Everyone's allowed to vote, and so forth and so forth. That's the ideal that we hold up to, that we try to hold ourselves, or some of us try to, whatever. I'm not going to get off in the politics, but that's that. So when we say equality, we generally think of it as being some abstract political idea. But that's not what we mean here. For one thing, in Buddhism, there are very few abstract concepts when you really come down to it. It's actually, there's not a whole complicated metaphysics in Buddhism. It's a very stripped down, it's a very pragmatic philosophy. But I don't need to go there, because just because I work on epistemology doesn't mean that I need to bore you with it. Right. So it's actually, when we're talking about the equality of self and other, it's saying that we and all other beings are essentially the same. That's what we mean. So equality here means like the sameness of ourselves and all other sentient beings. And so what are we the same in? As Shantideva says in the verse, we're equal in both pain and pleasure. So we are equal in that all sentient beings can experience sensations of pain, suffering. And not only that, sentient beings don't like the feelings of pain, and they want to be free of pain, generally, right? So you've got, everyone wants to be free of pain and suffering. That is the same for all sentient beings. Like we had the lobster released last weekend, and when you notch the tails, they flip because it hurts. You can look at this. I saw one thing that always sticks. I saw a beetle in Nepal once that had been flipped over, and its abdomen had been eaten by a crow. It had no longer had an abdomen, but it was still alive, and its six legs were writhing back and forth. There was no point in turning it over because it had already, it's clearly was on its deathbed. But it didn't like it. It didn't want to experience that pain of, being injured and of now facing death. So this is the same for every sentient being: crustaceans, insects, humans, of course, mammals. We can look at this. All of the sentient beings that we see, they're all the same. Every single one of them, down to the tiniest ones, even the ones that we can't really see. Now, I don't know about single cell organisms. I'm not going to go either that way. Although I remember looking at amoebas underneath the microscope in 9th grade, but that wasn't really looking at for pain. That was more searching for pleasure, searching for something to eat. So that's the other part. Equal in pleasure is that there are things that feel good, and you want the things that feel good. Food, sex, warmth or comfort, I guess. The right temperature, I should say, because some beings don't like warm, some they prefer cold. There you like to be the temperature that is comfortable for you. So for humans, then we add clothing. It might be pleasure of being with people you love, and so forth. So every sentient being is the same in wanting pleasure. Because of our different types of makeups, then we have different ideas about what pleasure is. Some things that are pleasurable for some beings are painful for others or disgusting to others. For example, like dog do. It's disgusting for us, and it's delicious for dung beetles, right? But it's the same. The dung beetle wants to be happy. It wants to be fed. And so it goes looking for a poop that it can go feed itself on. So is there any sentient being that's not? So it's the same. So when we're talking about equality, we're saying that we and all sentient beings are the same in wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of suffering. And so then the question is, whose happiness is more important? Naturally, because of our ego clinging, we're most concerned about our own, because the experiences are so vivid to us that we naturally think of them as being really important. So when you feel pain, your pain is the pain that is going to consume you most. Or the pain of people that you like is the people you think of you and yours, people in your group, your circle, or beings in your circle, I should say, because you might have pets or something like that. But people you think of you. So you and yours are the ones that you're going to feel the most upset about when you see about pain. When you see a beetle that's had its abdomen ripped out and is writhing on the ground there, you might say, poor thing, but it's not like as if you had seen your mother with her guts ripped out, you'd feel different, right? So it's that we have that hierarchy of beings. And so the idea is that we want to get to the point where we can see every single sentient being as having the same wish and therefore deserving the same care and the same protection as we and those we love also deserve. That's what we mean by meditating on this equality of self and other. This is really important, and it's not so easy to get there because we have such deep attachment to ourselves and others. So that's what we mean. So that's what Shantideva is speaking about in this passage, the equality. But I think it's an important point to remember that when we talk about equality here in this text, we're talking about sameness. We're not talking about equality in the political sense. It's not a social thing. It's coming down to our own individual idea of why should we care more about our own suffering and pleasures than we care about others. So the next verse says, although of many different kinds, the hands and so forth are one as a body to protect. Likewise, though beings are different and separate in their joys and pains, they all are equal, the same as me in wanting comfort. So the issue here that Shantideva is talking about is that we feel to ourselves, well, like, I'm one person. I can protect me. I can somewhat. I can take care of me. I can try to protect me, but I can't protect all other sentient beings. There are too many. There's so many people. But we think of ourselves as being one person, but are we really one person? Actually, if you think about it, we have all sorts of different body parts. We've got 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 hands, 2 feet. So that's already quite a few appendages. You've got elbows and knees, ears, noses, and all these different parts. They're all separate. They all have different characteristics. They're different parts. And yet we think of them all together as being one. And we think that this is one single thing that we need to protect. So just as our fingers and our toes and our hands and our feet and all the different body parts are different parts of the body, all other sentient beings are also different and separate beings. Just like, your right thumb is not your left thumb. No, your right thumb is not your left little finger. I'm trying to get I'm speaking and getting my wrong finger. What hand is which? So it's like this. I'm doing some sort of weird sign, some weird mudra here. But it's basically saying that, this thumb and that little finger are different appendages. They're different. They're separate. When I get hurt when I have a pain in my right thumb, I do not necessarily have a pain in my left pinky. Right? So they're separate, they're different. But we think of it all as being one, as being the same, and something that we need to protect. And so this word one here, actually in Tibetan and in Sanskrit, often the word for one, eka or chi, can also mean the same. The same in being something. So it's just as I have to protect my thumb, I have to protect my little finger and every other bodily part, right? It's the same with other sentient beings. Even though they're separate and different, just the fact that they're separate and different does not mean that you shouldn't protect them, because they're all the same in experiencing pleasure and wanting to experience pleasure, and experiencing pain and wanting to be free of that pain, experiencing suffering and wanting to be free of suffering. So this is what this verse is talking about. Otherwise, it seems kind of cryptic. What are we saying? But basically, just as the body is made up of different parts that are all the same and being something that we need to take care of, likewise, all sentient beings are separate and different, but They're all worthy of being cared for. So what is the reason why? Why is it that we experience suffering? As Shantideva says, even though my own suffering does not cause harm to others' bodies, my suffering is unbearable because of ego clinging. So here, I have if I'm experiencing suffering, for example, imagine that with my right hand, including my right thumb, I smash my left pinky. It hurts, right? There's harm. But that doesn't cause harm to any other sentient being. Still, that pain of having smashed my left pinky is hard. It's unbearable. I can't stand that pain. Or any other pain. If you get sick, if you have any other type of suffering, that pain is for you is unbearable. And you want to be rid of it. And the reason it's unbearable is because you think, as I'm experiencing this pain, it's because of our ego clinging. It's me, I'm experiencing it. And it's unbearable for me. So that's why it's unbearable. It's unbearable to me. Well, it's exactly the same for all of their sentient beings. Likewise, the sufferings of others have no effect on me, but still, their suffering is unbearable because of ego clinging. So when another sentient being, no matter who they are, experiences suffering, they don't like it. It doesn't affect me. If Tashi, I'm going to use a Tibetan name, if Tashi smashes his fingers with a hammer, Tashi is having pain, but I am not. So why shouldn't I feel? Why shouldn't I say? Why shouldn't I think? Oh, can I remove Tashi's suffering? She might be having some sort of problem. Whatever. Who knows? Similarly, when you have any other sentient being, and it's not just physical suffering. Someone's having a hard time financially. They're having a hard time in their life. There are many different crises we have. It's always hardest for ourselves. Well, it's the same for other sentient beings. Now, if the person is close enough to ourselves, then we're going to feel some sort of compassion. But do we feel that for other people? So the whole point of this meditation is not just to think about ourselves and our own, but to see if we can expand our concern further and further out so that we have the same amount of concern for all sentient beings, every single one. For example, we are in the world right now, there is the war in Ukraine. And probably for most of us here, it is easier for sympathy, to feel sympathy for the Ukrainians, just because of the information we get, what we hear, our proclivities and so forth. We're more likely to feel, well, you might be the other way around. I don't know. And it doesn't really matter. You feel more for the Ukrainians, for example, and less for the Russians. When we see the stories about Ukrainian civilians who've been, or the pictures of their corpses or so forth, we think about how horrible it was for what they went through. That is true. That is suffering. But do we feel the same way for the Russian conscripts who are blown up? They're also experiencing suffering. So do we have the same? So we have to get it. Now, it takes a while to get to the point where you have the same amount of suffering, but still the Russian conscripts who are wounded in battle or who are killed in battle are experiencing suffering. And that suffering doesn't have any effect on us, but it is still suffering. It is still unbearable to them because of their clinging, their ego clinging. And so therefore, what is different about that suffering than our own? Shouldn't we also try to have compassion for them? When we think about it, actually, the people who in the war who are committing the atrocities are in some ways the ones who should actually have the most compassion for. The reason why we should have the most compassion for these people, even though they are on any level, they're doing horrible things. But because they're doing horrible things, in the future, they're going to reap the karmic results of that. And when they repeat the karmic results of that, the suffering is going to be unbearable, just as our own suffering is. It's going to be unbearable because of ego cling, because they cling to their bodies or so forth, or whatever future body it is. That suffering is going to be unbearable. And because they are committing bad acts, then they're likely, if we think about the karmic cause and effect, they're likely to experience tremendous, tremendous suffering for extremely long times in their future births. And so if you think about the quantity of the suffering, well, the Ukrainians are experiencing suffering. For example, if they torture someone for, there's some accounts about torturing people for 2 hours before killing them, or imprisoning them for a few days and then killing them. Well, what's that compared to, say, assuming that there are rebirths in hells and that they end up being reborn in a hell where their lifetime lasts millions of years, and that they do this for every single person that they killed? That's a long, long time. So the Ukrainians who are being killed are experiencing the results of their own previous actions. We still have to feel compassion for them. We still, of course, have to pray for them and do whatever we can to help. But that suffering is limited compared to the suffering. So we have to keep that in mind too, that it has to be for everyone. Now, when you're going through the stages of the meditation, it's hard to do that. It might be easier for Russian soldiers off in a country who aren't actually directly threatening you. It's even harder when you're dealing with someone who's threatening you personally. But of course, in Maine, we have less experience with that. In North America, in general, we have less experience with that. But of course, it does still happen. But when you have someone who's actually really threatening you personally, then how do you feel compassion for that person? So this is another interesting issue, but I'm digressing quite a bit. So to come back to the text, I will dispel other suffering, since it is suffering like my own. I shall bring benefit to others, since they are beings like my body. So here Shantideva is saying that because the suffering that all sentient beings is the same, it doesn't matter if it's my suffering or anyone else's suffering. I still need to do anything I can to dispel it. And the reason is because it is suffering. It's painful. It doesn't matter who it's painful to. It is painful. And if we have the bodhicitta motivation of wanting to bring all sentient beings to happiness and relieve them of suffering, then any suffering is something that we need to try to do, try to overcome. So I shall bring benefit to others, since they are beings like my body. So all sentient beings want to experience pleasure. They want to be happy. They want to be comfortable. They want to be warm and fed. Well, warm is what we say for humans. They want to be the right temperature. Polar bears, it's a different thing. Or seals, I don't know. They want to be, they want to be just that perfect temperature where they are. You want to be comfortable, fed. Humans, you want to be clothed and have some sense of security. Whatever. You want to be happy. So we want to benefit them, like do things that are going to bring them happiness. And why? Because they're beings like my body. So this is kind of an interesting analogy here. I think if you were dealing, since there's translation, we can get away with it. I think an author who submitted this in a manuscript to, as a recent composition to an editor, they'd say, well, why is it that the body is like sentient beings? The body is just a piece of flesh, and what are the other beings? Well, it's actually that's like, just as your body can feel comfortable, it feels good to have pleasure in your body. You take your own body as the example for what it's like to feel pleasure, because your body feels good when it's fed, when you're warm, and so forth. You know that other sentient beings also like being fed and comfortable, being the right temperature for them. So it's like, because we have the understanding of what our bodies are like, we can therefore understand what other sentient beings like and they don't like. So that's why the analogy is of a body here. For when both I and others are the same in wanting to be happy, and they're no different from me, why only work for my own pleasure? And when both I and others are the same and wanting not to suffer, and they're no different from me, then why protect myself, not others? So we have this the whole point is that we treasure ourselves, and because we treasure ourselves, we then don't give the pleasures or the pains of other beings as much a thought as our own. So here's the like the Shantideva's commitment. It's like saying we're the same. We're the same in wanting to be happy. So just as I want to be happy, they're the same. So I need to work for them. So the whole point here is to kind of reduce our cherishing of ourselves and cherish others equally to ourselves. See that they're equally important, all other sentient beings. And their suffering is just important for the same reason. If I will not protect them, since their suffering does not cause me harm, then future suffering as well does not harm me. So why guard against it? So you might think to yourself, okay, well, it makes no sense for me to try to protect other sentient beings because their harm isn't going to affect me. Those Russian soldiers who are blown up in that tank, fine, it ain't me. I'm not in that tank, that's them. Or that other person, that's a distant example. There are other people who are close. You see people who are suffering, people you don't know, or people you don't like, and you see that they're in pain and suffering, and it's like, yeah, so what? Doesn't harm me. Well, why then do we work to prevent ourselves from experiencing future suffering? The reason why it makes no sense to do that is because the being in the future who's going to experience it is not you. It's another being in your continuum in the future, but it's not you now. It's a different being. If it's a different lifetime, then maybe that's going to be, I don't know, maybe it's going to be a cute puppy. I don't know what it's going to be. Maybe it's going to be another human. Maybe it's going to be something worse. Maybe something better. But it's a different being. So if you think to yourself, well, I'm going to do some misdeed, I'm going to murder, it's not going to affect me. We don't think that way. We think, I'm going to avoid it. I don't want to do that because I don't want to suffer in the future. So it is erroneous to think it's me who will experience them because it is one being who dies and yet another who is born. So we avoid doing things that are going to cause harm to us, especially in this lifetime. I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there because it's going to hurt. We avoid those things that are going to cause our harm. But why, if we think that it's not going to harm me when another sentient being is harmed, then it's the same, because that future being is not yourself. It's one person who dies and yet another who is born. For example, when you are born, you're yay big, right? Not that big. And then you can't do anything. And you get bigger and bigger, and then you start to be able to do things. And then you get to a point where you're like school age. And that school age kid is different than a little baby. Boy or girl, whatever, doesn't matter, they're different. The kid in school can run around and play and do things and study and think to a certain degree, maybe not all that well. Sometimes they don't use their minds, but they can run and they can talk and they play and do all this stuff. The little infant can't do a thing. Then you get to be fully grown. And okay, so you've been through all your schooling for too long, and then you have to get a job. And you do all this stuff as we do in our society. You have to work. You're full grown, and you think you do the things that you think you have to do to bring yourself and the people around you happiness. Getting a job and earning money, or whatever you think you have to do to bring happiness. That's one person. And then there's when you're getting older, and you're no longer able to work the way you were, or you retire or something like that. You get different, you might even change your jobs. And it's a different person in all of these stages. And then you become elderly. And then the person who's dying is yet a different person. For example, if I take my own self as an example, I was in 1967, I was a baby in Western Massachusetts. Right now, I am a 54-year-old man in Maine. These two are completely different person, right? When I was in college, I was in Ohio. I'm now in Maine. I didn't speak Tibetan. I wasn't a monk. I wasn't the same person. So it's changing throughout your life. Now I'm how I am. And in 10 years, I'm going to be drooling, lose my memory. Maybe not 10, maybe 20, if I live that long, maybe 40 years. I always love the way Sita Rinpoche talks about it. If I lived 100, then all I'm going to be able to do is eat soup. And then he laughs. So at some point, I might be toothless and only able to, I won't even be able to eat, oatmeal. I quote, unable to chew oatmeal, what will I do? So, a different person we always think we're one person that's always there, but actually we're changing at every moment. And so if it's not logical to help someone else or to help anyone else because their suffering is not yours, then it's not logical to prevent your own future suffering either. If they whose suffering it is themselves must guard themselves from it, since the foot's pain is not the hand's, why should the one protect the other? So you might say that, well, especially here in America, we're free and we're independent. I'm going to take care of me. You can take care of you. And I'm not going to worry about you. But that also is an erroneous way of thinking about it, because actually, it's like, if that which is experiencing the pain should remove its own pain, then if you get a thorn in the foot, then the foot should take out its own thorn. This is America. Yo, foot. This is America. You are going to take out your own thorn. Right hand, don't you do it. It's the foot's job. It's going to pull itself up by its bootstraps, pull out its own thorn, right? But we don't do it like that. If you follow that, then there'd be no reason for a mother to take care of her baby. There'd be no reason for volunteer fire people to get up in the middle of the night and drive as fast as they can to some place to risk their lives to protect other beings, right? There wouldn't be any reason to, but we do it. And so it's like you can't just think, well, it's not me. It's their job. They can take care of it. It's our responsibility, particularly as people who are contemplating bodhicitta and taking the bodhisattva vow. Right? Once you've taken the bodhisattva vow, the wish is to dispel the suffering of all sentient beings, and in particular in the context of the way of the bodhisattva. What did we say? What did Shantideva say? It's like, I'm making the promise to be a bridge for those who need it, a nurse, the medicine, everything for all sentient beings. And then you get to the 8th chapter, it's like, you're supposed to meditate on this. Nah, I think not, maybe not. No, it doesn't work. So especially if you want to have the motivation of bodhicitta, any single sentient being, no matter whether it's a type of insect you don't like, a black fly, or if it is any other sentient being, it's still a being who experiences pain and doesn't like it, a being who wants to be happy. Even though it's illogical, you say. So this is here we've got in the next verse, we've got the Shantideva talking here, taking the voice of someone else saying, even though it's illogical, we act from ego clinging, you say. So here you say, well, okay, I'm just an ordinary person. We all have ego clinging, like this is Buddhism. We talk about ego clinging. So we have ego clinging, and that's why I work to take care of myself. I'm going to take care of me because I cling to me as being being a real person, and that's because of that. Since I have that ego clinging, I have to take care of myself. So Shantideva's response is, we must, as much as possible, give up fallacious selves and others. It's the idea of there being a me and being a self. We think of the me as being like your body and everything, all the different parts of your body put together. Or you might think of your me as being like You know that talk about that going from the infant all the way up to being to the adult, to being the elderly person, to being the dying person. There's like the continuum of one being. You can think that there's some essence of Khenpo David that started in June of 1967 and is going until who knows when, right? Is there? Well, there's a continuum. It's sort of the same. Well, we say that there's a continuum. We say that there's a, but is it really that? So we cling to ourselves as being a me, one single enduring me. But and because of that, then we are more interested in taking care of ourselves than in taking care of others. But that idea itself is actually a fiction. It's not how it actually is. When you look at it, you can't see there's anything that actually is. So if you think of yourself, we think of ourselves as either being a continuum that goes over the course of a lifetime, or maybe into future and past and future lifetimes, or we think of ourselves as an aggregate of many things put together, right? And so Shantideva speaks about that in the next stanza, where he says, continua and aggregates like series, armies, and such are false. The suffering one does not exist. So who is it that this belongs to? So what Shantideva is saying here is that if you think of yourself as being like the continuum of one being from the time you're born until your death, and then maybe going on to the next life, that's not a real idea. And it's like a series. Like if you have a series of ants walking in a line, going one after another, you've got a long line of ants, a series of ants they're walking through. But each of those individual ants is a discrete ant. Or is it? Well, they look like discrete ants, so we're not going to get too metaphysically or too philosophical here. You've got all these discrete ants that are walking through. There are different particulars that are walking, but each individual ant, you've got, what are the ants' names? I never watched any of these ant movies. You can think of the ant names. They're all different names, right? You've got ant A, B, C, D, and so forth. Or if you have, so they're all going through that series, that line of ants there's not any real thing that is a line other than those ants. Or if you think about the line of houses on your street, well, there's a line of houses, but actually they're just four or five individual houses, or however many houses on your street. There's no separate line of houses other than where you are. And it's the same thing with an aggregate. When you have an aggregate of many things put together, it's the same. There's no individual thing. Like, for example, these days, I go back to the current events. They speak about a battalion of soldiers, whatever army, it doesn't matter. And there are a certain number of soldiers in a battalion, let's say, I don't know, 5,000. So you have 5,000 soldiers in a battalion. Well, is there any battalion independent of those 5,000 soldiers and the equipment that they have? You put it all together and you give it the name battalion, but there's nothing real that is actually a battalion. So it's a fiction. And it's the same with our idea of ourselves. Like, we have, the body is made up of all sorts of different body parts, and our mind is made up of all sorts of different consciousnesses and thoughts and feelings and so forth, all the consciousnesses and mental factors. So there are all multiple different things. So there's not any individual thing. It's a fallacious idea. Similarly, there is a continuum that goes from beginning to end. So in this way, the suffering one, the person who is experiencing suffering, does not exist. So who is it that this belongs to? So you think that your suffering belongs to you, it's your suffering, so therefore you should take care of it. But if there's no for you to take care of, there is the suffering that needs to be eliminated, or the experience of the illusion of suffering that needs to be eliminated. But there's no one really experiencing it. Still, we need to eliminate that illusion of suffering. And that illusion of suffering is the same for every other sentient being. So why don't we want to eliminate it for them? That suffering has no owner is no different for anyone. That's the same point, that if there's no me who owns the suffering, there's no one. It's like, it's my suffering. If there's really no real me, it's the same. So I will dispel it since it's painful. In this, why should I set a limit? Just because its nature is painful, then it is important for us to eliminate our own and all sentient beings' suffering. We shouldn't set a limit of saying, I'm going to, either a limit of saying, I can only do so much, or a limit of, I'm only going to do the people in my group and not any other sentient being, or so forth. So basically, as Shantideva says, there's no dispute the suffering of everyone must be prevented. This is in terms of the Buddhist context, of course. So he's, Shantideva was giving this, taught this in Nalanda to a large crowd of people who were all essentially Buddhists. So everyone says, yes, we have to eliminate suffering. So if mind's prevented, prevent all, or else like beings, not mine either. So there's no reason why I should single out our own suffering for special treatment just because me, the most important being of all is me, right? So therefore my suffering is more important. This is not the way we should think of it. So then the problem comes up that we think that compassion is just too painful. We're trying to eliminate suffering, but when you think about compassion for sentient beings, you think about all the atrocities we hear about, all the suffering we have, all the people who are suffering of various diseases, COVID or any other disease, the people who are suffering of all the different problems, any instance of suffering we see in the world. Then you start to feel compassion. Well, we think, well, compassion hurts. Because compassion is kind of feeling others' pains, thinking about it. And it's too painful, I can't go there. But Shantideva points it, so as it says here, compassion is too painful, you say, so why arouse it with such effort? I want to feel good. And what if I'm thinking about other people suffering, then I'm just going to feel bad, I'm going to get sad and depressed. But when you think of beings' torments, how is the pain of compassion greater? For if a single suffering eliminates many miseries, those with compassion will induce that suffering in themselves and others. So compassion can be kind of painful. It can be kind of like you really feel it, and you feel like you're going to break your heart when you're feeling strong compassion. But how is that greater than the suffering of other sentient beings, like the people who are actually experiencing the suffering? We hear about the tortures that are going on in Ukraine, or the pain. We can hear about this pain that any of the people who are participating in it, Russian or Ukrainian or Syrian or whatever, they're from, the suffering that they experience when they are wounded or tortured or whatever is terrible. We can feel compassion for it, but we're not actually feeling that physical suffering. When you have a friend who's going through a divorce and they're suffering terribly, you can feel compassion for them. You might remember your own experience of divorce or whatever, but you're not feeling it the same way they do, even when you have compassion. But when you have that, when you experience compassion, then it actually is beneficial because it helps you overcome suffering in general. For if a single suffering eliminates many miseries, those with compassion will induce that suffering in themselves and others. For example, if you want to protect yourself from the suffering of suffering of disease, then you're going to go through a medical treatment that hurts. You need to get a knee replacement. Your knee hurts. Well, you get pain, you go through a surgery, and the surgery hurts. And then the recovery hurts. And yet you go through it because you know that once you've recovered from it, you're going to be able to walk again, and it won't hurt to walk. This is the same thing. If you know that a smaller suffering is going to prevent larger suffering, then you willingly undergo it. So those with compassion will induce that suffering in themselves and others. Like, if you see someone hobbling around and you know that they need knee surgery, you say, okay, you just got to go and get the surgery. Yeah, it's going to hurt, but you got to do it. So in the same way, when you have compassion, that compassion is painful. It can be painful. It can also be, it's kind of strange. It's different than other types of pains, but you are willing to put up with it, and you encourage other people to put up with the pain and suffering of compassion in order to achieve the happiness that comes from the benefits that come from compassion. And the benefit that comes from compassion is that you develop bodhicitta, and because of bodhicitta, then you can become a Buddha. And so there's no benefit like that. And if you can bring other people to also experience compassion, though it's painful, can be painful, then it also brings them to Buddhahood. And that also, so you induce that suffering. Yes, bring on the suffering of compassion. It's like the masochistic version of bodhicitta meditation. It's like, bring it on more, because we realize that we want it more. And actually, we have a higher capacity for it than we think. Thus, even though Sapushpa Chandra knew that the king would cause him harm, he did not shy away from pain to end the sufferings of many. So here Shantideva is referring to a story. So the story of Sapushpa Chandra. This is a story from the King of Samadhi Sutra, and the King of Samadhi Sutra is on the 84,000 website. And I highly recommend that you all read it, because it's in English. It's a long sutra, and this is from chapter 36. Well, I might as well. Oh, yeah. So here I have it on my iPad. You can't read it from where you are. I can show it to people on the screen too, show and tell. You can download it on the, they have a nice app, and it's translated by Peter Roberts, who many of you know. So that makes it, for those of you who know Peter, it's even more worth reading it, because you know that he is, I mean, he's a very good translator. He's a very good person. He's, so many of us know him. So, it's worth reading this sutra on the 84,000. And in this sutra, there's a story of Sapushpa Chandra. And so there was, this is at the end of the eon of a Buddha whose name is Ratnapanda Chandra Vishuddha Abhyutkata Raja. That's a long name, all one word. Ratnapanda Chandra Vishuddha Abhyutkata Raja. So he had passed into nirvana, and this was the end of the time when his dharma was around in the world. And then at that time, a lot of people were falling away from the dharma. There were fewer people had faith in it. And there was a king named Shuddhadatta. So Shuddhadatta had a harem with 84,000 queens. He had 1,000 sons and 500 daughters. And he had a beautiful capital city called Ratnavati. It was vast. It had 4 gates and has, all sorts of beautiful architectural features, just an absolutely beautiful city. And many people at that time didn't like hearing about sutras. They didn't like Dharma teachings, and they rejected them, and they were hostile to them. Now, there was the Dharma of the Buddha of that era was still present, but it was not. It was on the way out. So there at that time there was there were many bodhisattvas who left the city, and they all went up because they were being persecuted essentially. So they left and they all went to the forest, and their beautiful forest. They had everything they needed. It was just as beautiful as Shantideva describes, or even more beautiful. And among them, there was a monk named Sapushpa Chandra, and he was a teacher. He was teaching them the Dharma, and he was really beautiful. He, what do we say? He was. He had beautiful complexion, black hair, a joy to look at. He had the one single hair between his eyebrows that curled in a clockwise fashion. Just an absolutely beautiful being. Everyone who looked at him just recognized how beautiful he was. And he taught the Dharma. He taught people how to practice the meditation of the Dharani meditation, the meditation of retention. And then one day he developed a clairvoyant powers, and he saw with his pure divine sight that there were many beings actually in the capital city of this evil king, who had with his big harem and all of a sudden the children who didn't like the Dharma. But there were many of the people, many of his sons and daughters, many of the queens in his harem, many of the people in that city also had the propensities for the Dharma. And if they were awakened, then they could be brought to a place to achieve an irreversible state where they could, an irreversible state means a state where they'll be continually advancing towards enlightenment without ever falling back into the lower realms. But if he didn't go to teach the Dharma, then they would that none of them would progress, and they would all fall into lower realms in the future lifetimes and experience terrible suffering. He also saw that if he went, it could provoke an obstacle to his life. But he said, fine, I'm not going to worry about that. And so he told his group of the Bodhisattvas, the 7,000 Bodhisattvas who was with him in the forest, he said, okay, well, if I go into the capital city and I teach the Dharma, it will benefit many sentient beings. And they said, don't go there. Please, you are too beautiful. You have beautiful complexion. You have beautiful black hair. You have the single urna between your eyebrows that turns clockwise, the single hair that turns clockwise between your eyebrows. And if you teach Dharma, the king will not like it and he will kill you. You should not go. Please don't go. Please stay here. Think of us. And please do not do this. And then the Supushpachandra said, but if I go, I'll bring more benefit to all these sentient beings who otherwise will never have any chance. They'll fall back to the lower realm. If I go and teach them the Dharma, they will achieve an irreversible state. So he went to the city. And he went in on the first day. I'm making the story short. So he went to the villages, the towns, the market towns, the kingdom, the regions, and the capital, where he taught the Dharma to beings. So in the morning, when he would go into the place in the morning, he would teach the Dharma to beings, and then while he would establish great numbers of beings into the Dharma, taught the Dharma, and then he taught past his lunchtime. And so he left and he went out where there was, outside of the city, where there was a stupa that had relics of the Buddha's hair and fingernails. And he stayed there, standing all night long, fasting. Then the second day, he went into the city and he taught the Dharma, and he brought many people to see the truth and established them in the irreversible state. And he did not have his meal. He missed his meal time, so he went back to the stupa and he stayed there standing all night long, fasting for a second day. Then on the third day, on that third morning, he went back to the city and he brought more teachings. It says 999 million beings in the sutra. But he had not had his meal, and therefore fasting for a third day, he emerged from the city and went to the stupa, and he stood there all day and all night. And then on the fourth day, he did the same. And on the fifth day, he did the same, but this time he went into the king's harem, where he had the 84,000 queens. Going into king's harems was really dangerous. But he didn't get caught. And he taught the Dharma, and many of the queens in the harem also made irreversible progress toward the highest enlightenment. He also taught many townspeople, but he didn't have his meal. So he left and he went out to the stupa. Then on the seventh morning, he went in, and on that day, King Shuddhadatta decided to leave and go to enjoy himself in the pleasure park outside the city. And as he was going along, he saw this beautiful, everyone in the procession, he went with his 1,000 sons, his 500 daughters, all of his queens, with his army. They were all going together in a huge procession out to go enjoy themselves in the pleasure parks. And they saw this beautiful bhikshu, this beautiful monk, the Dharma teacher, Supushpachandra, and all of the queens and all of the king's sons and daughters saw him, and they immediately felt faith. So they got off they dismounted from their palanquins, the litters that they were being carried on. They dismounted from their horses. They went and they paid respects to this beautiful Dharma practitioner. Now, some of the chariots and horses going by had kicked up some dust, and he had got some dust in his eyes, so he was kind of blinking his eyes as he was looking at them, teaching the Dharma. And he established them because of their faith, he established them in the irreversible state, and brought delight, brought them delight and satisfaction. And then the king Shuddhadatta saw Alas, my harem has gone astray, and so has the populace. They've cast off everyone in their harem. They wanted to make an offering, so they took off all of their jewels and all of their finery, and they gave them to the bhikshu. He had this big pile, and the king saw this, thinking, "What are they doing?" And he's handsome. Those queens are never going to look at me again. He's so handsome. This just can't be. And is he winking at them? Because he had this bit of dust in his eye. And so this cannot last. He said to his sons, you have to kill this bhikshu because the queens will never come back to me. You have to kill the bhikshu. Yes. Father, please think about what you're saying. This is a great Dharma teacher. You can't do this. If you do this, it'll be terrible karma for yourself and all other sentient beings. It's not going to work. You can't do it. And they refused. And he was really angry. But then he saw his favorite executioner, Nandika. And he said to Nandika, okay, you go and kill him. And you make sure to cut off all of his limbs, cut off his ears, eyes, and nose, and gouge his eyes out because everyone's looking at him. And so the executioner did as he said. But when he chopped chopped Subhushpachandra's limbs and eyes and ears and everything off, there was no blood. It flowed, milk flowed out. And then light shone out from this and then went to all the different regions. Then it came back and it absorbed back in his body. And people were just amazed. And the king was still angry. He went off to the pleasure park, leaving the body of the Dharma teacher there. And he spent 7 days at the pleasure park, but he did not have a good time. he just couldn't enjoy himself. You go to a pleasure park and man, what did I do? I'm not sure that anyone had a good time. Then they were going back in, and when they got back, they're coming back into the city, they saw the corpse of the remains of Subhushpachandra sitting there, still chopped apart, but none of them had decayed, even the slightest. And then the king realized, what a terrible thing he'd done. And because he realized how terrible he'd done, he felt incredible regret. And he realized that he was going to fall into hell in his next lifetime because of that. He built a stupa, and then and always continued to pay respects to the sutra. But he was still reborn in the lowest of hells as a result of that karma of killing that Dharma teacher. So that Dharma teacher that he killed, Subhushpachandra, was later reborn as the Bodhisattva, the youthful Chandraprabha, the youthful moonlight, who later became reborn as Khenpo. The king Shuddhadatta was then reborn as the Buddha Shakyamuni. So this is interesting. So as it says in the first chapter, even grave events bring benefit. Even when you do something horrible to a Bodhi or Bodhisattva, it creates a connection that leads to a good result in the future. Now, this is the story from the sutra. We can also think of stories, and it's sometimes hard for us to believe them because it sounds so fantastic. You know, light flying, shining out from the wounds, don't believe it. But there are historical examples of this too that we can think about. For example, there's the Indian teacher Atisha. The Tibetans came to ask Atisha to go to Tibet, and I'm not going to tell the whole story. You can rest. It's getting late anyways. So Atisha prayed to Green Taro, who was his main meditational deity, and he had a vision of Tara who said, "If you go to Tibet, you will benefit many sentient beings, but your life will be shorter." And what did Atisha say? I'm going to Tibet. I don't care. Right? So it's going to cause me harm, but I'm doing it anyways. Or we can think about like the 16th Karmapa when he passed away in 1981. When he had stage 4 cancer and he went traveling, everyone said, oh, you need to go and get treatment. And he probably knew that treatment wasn't going to help, but he knew that it would help. So he went to Hong Kong. He spent some time in Hong Kong getting treatment, which didn't really help. But while there, he made connections with Koko and many other great Chinese masters. He developed a lot of people. A lot of people were brought into the Dharma because of him visiting Hong Kong. He then came to the United States, and he passed away in Zion, Illinois, in a hospital just outside of Chicago. And when he was there, people would ask him, "How are you feeling?" He said, "Oh, I'm okay." "And how are you doing?" Then, of course, they'd examine and say, "How does he feel like this?" Because he was just riddled with cancer, usually a very painful condition, but he was fine. And then he passed away. So he benefited many beings. And as a result of him doing that, this is something that has inspired a lot of faith in people at the time. But he could have stayed in Sikkim and it would have been the same for him. But he went through all the effort of going through Hong Kong and putting other people in front of himself. So this is not something that is entirely unreasonable, and it's not something that we don't see in our own lives. In fact, there are dogs that jump in the water to rescue people. They even do it to rescue people they don't know. So it's not an entirely unreasonable thing. It's just, how can we take the seed that we have within us, within all sentient beings, and make it bigger so it is beneficial so we can bring benefit to all sentient beings. So I'll just go through one or two more verses tonight. So those who have trained their own mind streams will enter even the incessant with joy for quelling others' woes, like swans alighting on lotus ponds. So when you have strong bodhicitta and strong compassion, you no longer really worry about other sentient beings or yourself. Excuse me, I have to do the same thing as Susie is doing. I have to plug my computer in now that I'm looking at my battery going down. I should have done this at the beginning before we started, shouldn't I? What to do? There we are. I think. Maybe not. There we are. Okay, so when you have bodhicitta, when you have the wish of bodhicitta, the joy of helping other sentient beings is greater than any sensation of pain. There's the absolute joy of being able to help other sentient beings. You don't care about any other physical pain. So you're even happy to do such things as go to hell. For example, there was the great master Langri Thampa, who was a Tibetan master, and he spent his entire lifetime really meditating on bodhicitta. When he got to the moment of his death, he was like praying, "May I be reborn in hell. Please let me be reborn in hell." Because he really wanted to be reborn in hell. He was not at all afraid of the idea. In fact, what he was really unhappy about is, I'm having all these pure visions of being reborn in a pure realm. Why is this happening? I really want to be reborn in hell and help the sentient beings in hell. So for someone like that, it's like when you have a really strong bodhicitta, there's no end to the joy. When beings have been liberated, it's not the ocean of joy that brings sufficient in and of itself. What good is wanting liberation? For example, if you think about the worst person, like if you think about what would it be like if Vladimir Putin was suddenly achieved Buddhahood tomorrow? The war would end. There'd be peace on earth. It'd be excellent. All the pain and suffering that he causes. Or what would it think as if your least favorite American politician would all of a sudden become a Buddha? Then they wouldn't be able to do anything to harm. They wouldn't even think of doing anything to harm you. So what greater joy of that when any sentient being is liberated, even if it's not, if any sentient being is even brought a step further along, isn't that joy enough joy in itself? So though I have done good for others, I'm not conceited or amazed. Solely enjoying helping others, I've no hope for a ripened result. So you do it without any hope for yourself. There's nothing to be conceited about. It's just what you do. And without any hope for anything in the future, you will do whatever you can. Thus, just as I protect myself from any blame, no matter how slight, For others, I will likewise be protective and compassionate. And so this is the kind of the, just as we see ourselves, we see all other sentient beings as ourselves. This is the point of training. Now, the practicalities of training are not what Shantideva goes into here. This is the way Shantideva works here. Shantideva is primarily giving us the reasons why we need to think about things. He doesn't go into the specifics of meditation practices so much. Get a little bit of that later, but not so much. But generally, we're thinking about this. So when you are thinking about the specifics of a compassion practice or of a bodhicitta practice, or you're thinking about, like, for example, the 7 points of mind training, when you're thinking about that, if you think about what Shantideva is saying in this passage and then bring it into your practice, then it helps you develop your compassion bodhicitta. Right? So it's not that he's giving specific instructions on meditation, because there are specific instructions on how to do this, how to develop that same feeling. But instead, he's giving us the sort of intellectual idea of like, oh, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could? Make us want to do it instead of giving specific instructions on how to do it. So I think that's enough. I've gone a little bit more than perhaps I should have tonight. I got carried away and perhaps told a story a little bit longer than I don't know. I blabbed on it. Anyways, this is enough. We don't really have time for questions tonight, unless maybe we do. If someone has a pressing question, either live or over the internet. If there are no pressing questions, then we will recite the dedication prayers. And because I've gone, let's see how to get those up. Where did it go? I have to open the file with those chants again. Okay. So we're going to recite the dedication prayer, or the long life prayer for the Karmapa that is in your booklets that I think many of you know. And what page is it on the booklets? Okay, the final section that says closing chants. We'll start with the prayer for the Karmapa Miche Tapa Ranjan Shugiku. Then we will recite the long life prayer for Rinpoche that I believe you already have. And then we will go into the prayers for Sakhavati, which are in this handout that you have, or they will be on the screen for those of you watching. And where am I? Sorry, too many things going on. I have to think about all of these. Hang on. Okay. O Miche Tapa Ranjum Chögingum Jutru Suji Kurshen Karma Pe Sang Sun Dorje Kam Surab Denjim Taye Chile Lundru Kalmajo. Oh, sorry, one page to it. O Same Yeshe Dambe Duzine Chime Tse Bombar Chilvez Yamne Songjo Chagile Zen Batewam Rupa Me Pegelez Jime Tawe Gegyan Chedro Shilundo Chigi Yura Sidze Marketan Drube Lundo Yonzo Bamawe Senge Chene no, excuse me. Angyada injase tu che na da la da dran son trupa nam gir da gi ha san ge we den do gi jishin mumba ge me ru jor chik. Now the same prayer in English. Between your hands, united in equipoise, you hold the vase of deathlessness that collects the nectar, the highest undefiled wisdom. Lord of life, Amitayus, grant auspiciousness. Far and wide, you sound the roar of fearless view. Up to the peak of existent blaze is your turquoise mane of the Dharma of scripture and realization. You have protected the physical strength, line, speech. I ask you to live long. Oh, excuse me, the lines got out of order. You have extended the physical strength of being learned, venerable, and accomplished. Line of speech, I ask you to live long. By the power of the victors, of their foremost strength, of the gods and sages and siddhas, and by the strength of the truth of my pure intentions, may my prayer be accomplished without any obstacles. I'm going to go through that. Now we have a couple of long life prayers. Do you have them on? Did you print the one I sent you earlier today, Ted, or no? We'll do that tomorrow. I did not. There were 2 short prayers of rebirth. Okay, we'll do those next. Okay. The 2 prayers for rebirth and Sukhavati. Let's do these in English tonight. Emaho, how wondrous is the Buddha, infinite light, with the Lord great compassion on his right, great power on his left, all in the midst of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas beyond number. As soon as I pass on, may I be born without another lifetime in between, in that pure land of untold happiness and wonder that is called Sukhavati, and see the Buddha's Amitabha's face. I ask all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, bless me that my prayer may be fulfilled without impediment. Tadyata Panchandriya Avabodhana is for Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of all times and all directions, please consider me. Rejoicing in the 2 accumulations, I offer all my merit to the jewels. Thus may the teachings of the Buddha thrive. I dedicate this virtue to all beings. May every sentient being reach Buddhahood. I gather all the virtues there may be in one, so they may ripen in my being. May I be cleansed of the 2 obscurations, and then perfect the 2 accumulations. May I live long, be healthy, and increase in both experience and realization. In this life may I rise to the 10 levels, and when I pass away, may I at once be born in the pure realm Sukhavati. When I am born there, may the lotus open, may I reach Buddhahood with that same body. Once I've achieved enlightenment, may I guide beings forever with my emanations. Sunam di tham je se pa ni tom ne nye pe dranam pam chen ke gana shi bala chupai si be sole droa by this merit may we not in omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing and free. All wanderers from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Okay, thank you very much. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. So thank you for joining this evening.